Our next speaker is Fiona Solomon. She is the CEO of the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, all about responsible sourcing, and I'm really looking forward to hearing how that stewardship initiative is progressing and what she can add to our conversation.
I'm here to talk a bit about the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. So our vision is very much to maximise the contribution of aluminium to a sustainable society, and we aim to do that by recognising and collaboratively fostering responsible production, sourcing and stewardship of aluminium. We have a multi-stakeholder membership and governance structure. We're a global organisation. We happen to be incorporated in Australia, but we have a large and growing membership. So our certification program is based on two standards, a performance standard and a chain of custody standard. So if you're familiar with, say, the Forest Stewardship Council, a similar kind of structure to them. So our performance standard sets out practices for sustainability and human rights principles, and it applies to companies all along the aluminium value chain. So from bauxite and the kind of primary aluminium production stages that Margie touched on, right through to kind of downstream uses of aluminium across a range of sectors. So building and construction, packaging, transport, other kinds of infrastructure, consumer products, and so on. And then to take the claims about practices at an entity or at a site or within a company, the chain of custody standard creates that link to talk about those practices and allocate that, if you like, to products and connect certified suppliers and customers through the value chain. And it does that based on accounting for material flow. And I'll give you a bit more of an example of that in a moment. So in essence, the certification program, if a company gets certified against both the performance standard and our chain of custody standard, then that can give you recognizable assurances for the responsible practices that those companies have put in place, and a means to talk about sourcing as you looked for that in your suppliers. We have a bunch of information on our website, so I encourage you to go and have a look at that. This is data from April. I think it's probably actually subsequently updated in May. But we've actually got 173 members now across 6 membership classes. There's 140 odd certifications that have been issued across 40 different countries and so on. So the kinds of countries where ASI is happening, we have a lot in Europe, but also in other places, and you'll see including right here in Australia. So we have bauxite, alumina and primary aluminium production certified here. There are 3 certified companies in Australia: Rio Tinto Aluminium, which we've heard a bit discussed about in Ashley's example. They have bauxite mines, they have alumina refiners, they have aluminium smelters that are covered by ASI certification. Alcoa have bauxite mines and alumina refining covered by ASI certification. And we also have a really terrific and interesting bauxite mine that's certified up in Gove in the Northern Territory, which is Indigenous owned and operated. So that's a really unique example, and indeed ASI has a Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum that is globally based, and where we engage with Indigenous communities that are impacted, particularly by bauxite mining and mineral processing stages. So this slide tries to take a step back and look at the whole global flow of aluminium mass globally, and the different steps in the supply chain. So you see, we've talked about mining, refining, production here means smelting, fabrication are the kinds of next steps after you have an ingot or a billet. So that includes things like extrusion, which Margie touched on. It's also rolling, it's also kind of casting into specific shapes like an engine block or a wheel, for example, for a car. There can be subsequent manufacturing stages past those sort of common sort of shapes. So you might have a extrusion profile that's been made in the fabrication stage, and then the manufacturing makes it into a window, for example. Once you get to the use stage, it's in for a period of time, and then you see the sort of outflows here. So there's a fair scrap loop that comes back, and there is obviously some aspects of these steps all show aluminium content of all of these. Otherwise, these pieces would be much bigger. So this is the aluminium content of bauxite, the aluminium content of the alumina, etc. So there's obviously step downs in volume for each of these, but this shows the aluminium content component. And this whole mass flow model is developed by the International Aluminium Institute. We have an MOU with them. So this little green stripe shows for 2019 the amount of ASI certified volume that is flowing through the global value chain, and that's reported by our chain of custody certified entities. We're collecting the 2020 data now and hope to have that out in the next couple of months. So I guess the key point with this slide is this is actually a pretty good start for year one. You know, these kinds of volumes. Obviously, you start to see it diminishing as you go through these stages, because with the chain of custody model, these supply chains need to fill before they can start coming back through. So here you can see an absolutely tiny kind of scrap component for those interested in the recycled dimension. That's still a very small flow. Within our chain of custody standard, we differentiate between pre and post-consumer scrap. So for pre-consumer scrap to flow through as ASI material, it must have already been ASI. You can't kind of say, oh, we've carved a bit off an aircraft wing and now we're going to call it scrap, so it's all good, and kind of laundered of its practices prior to that point. We only allow that once it's been through the use and end of life stages and comes back into the system at that point. So let's have a quick reflection on what we mean by responsible sourcing. I think a key point is really that it's multidimensional, and that's one of the challenges, in fact. So ASI standard looks to addresses the many topics and issues and risks and challenges within sustainability for a commodity like aluminium. But what we tend to see, and for for very good reasons, people might focus in on one piece. What about the kind of low carbon primary smelting, or what about what's happening with mining in Guinea or in other places and so on. So let's kind of walk through a few of those. Low carbon, obviously, with COP26 coming up, the Paris Agreement, the net zero kind of targets that we're all setting from a 2050 perspective, means this is really front and center for many people, and because aluminium is a very energy intensive metal. So we see that as having getting a lot of focus. We're seeing differentiation of brands, and I think Jeff gave a few examples of some of those kind of company branding around either this is recycled content or this is a low carbon kind of production. We also have, of course, impacts further upstream at the kind of mining end, whether it be around community and other impacts, biodiversity impacts from mining, these sorts of questions, and these shouldn't kind of be ignored, with a kind of a sole focus perhaps only on carbon. We also see the question of strategic materials, particularly in the EU context, where as economies are transitioning, we're actually seeing, and I'm sure you've seen this debate, a growth, in the use of metals to support that transition, and aluminium is one of those. Some of the battery metals are some of those as well. So by having a kind of a singular focus, perhaps on carbon, you can create these sort of unintended consequences in other places. So again, important to kind of keep your eye on the whole picture. We've had a bit of talk about scrap with some of the various pieces, and I think everyone's also touched on, the availability of scrap, what qualities it is, what quantities, who has the capacity to actually recycle that, and the issue too of potentially diverting flows from what are kind of closed loops that are for a particular alloy, for example, and diverting that into other applications. There's also some work going on that's come out of the kind of conflict mineral space, looking at conflict affected and high risk areas, human rights, corruption kind of risks. The London Metal Exchange, for example, is bringing in new responsible sourcing rules for its listed brands. These are smelters, as Margie was talking about in that supply chain. So we're going to see that responsible sourcing language around that sort of risk in particular too. So they're just some examples, and of course there are others. ASI aims to address all of these, but I think it's really important as you think, even though you're looking at embodied carbon in particular, to be aware of and to be considering this broader landscape of sustainability risks and challenges as well. So let's have just a look at some of those regional and sector variables with a particular thought on this sector, building and construction. I think some of the differences and maybe some of the reasons why you're seeing challenges in kind of accessing this sort of responsibly sourced supply, or maybe even low carbon, is that whether you've got system houses or the kinds of suppliers, it's often fragmented. You can have a lot of small contractors between the architects who commission and then the delivery to site. So in terms of models like chain of custody and so on, that creates some practical challenges in terms of wrapping your arms around that ecosystem. And we saw the complexity of the ecosystem in one of Jeff's slides. Often the projects are bespoke and design driven, and that's quite different to, say, packaging or automotive, which have kind of consistent runs, very large volumes. And so the investment that might be the customer demand, the customer signal, if you like, may merit more of an investment because of that kind of long-term and consistent product application that may be there. For example, if you are to develop a new rolling plant for automotive or for packaging, you're talking about $1 billion investment. And so, these are not kind of things that can scale up. They're highly specialized once you get to that, past that semi-fabrication stage into particular products. So while we have that upstream piece, in Australia of the smelters that pop out a nice fat ingot or billet, that is not something you can buy and stick in a building. There are all of these entities, in between that are needed to shape, the exact product that you're looking for. If we look about the Australian context, I talked about that there's ASI certifications that are here now. Those 3 companies are only to that smelter cast house stage, so that primary aluminium production. And there just isn't a lot of semi-fabrication or downstream manufacturing in Australia. That's just the nature of being a sort of a smaller market. So those challenges of sort of importing from overseas are likely to be there when you've got, the kind of issues perhaps in this sector particularly. So further segmenting responsible sourcing expectations by a particular ESG issue becomes very challenging. I would like locally sourced, low carbon, this and that. Those kinds of niche requirements are challenging in a smaller market like Australia. And then for recycled materials, as we kind of touched on and heard a bit with the previous presentation as well, it really depends on the scrap quality and quantity. There's challenges for smelters. If that's the stage that we've got to take that material into their supply chain, you can't go onto a smelter with a water bottle, for example, because of the risks of explosions. So even things like cans that may have small amounts of liquid, or just the kinds of risks that are associated with mixed scrap can be a bit challenging. And then there are also, again, as I said, sort of applications where there are closed loop efforts which are looking at developing very specialized alloys in the automotive sector that can take automotive parts and recycle them back into a bonnet or a battery housing or whatever, as there are now for can to can, in the aluminium can and packaging sectors as well. Coffee capsules is another example. In terms of the green building sector, we have done quite a bit of work on harmonisation. So we're, in terms of BREEAM, which is sort of a UK British sort of responsible sourcing certification scheme for the building sector, we're recognised by them, and we've been pre-approved for the LEED. They're doing some work on a pilot credit around social equity, and I assume that will expand to other kinds of material sourcing dimensions in the sustainability broader ESG context as well. I think the other thing I would just mention is, in terms of moving from asset to product level claims, even to kind of have a smelter saying this is our, we're 4 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per tonne of aluminium produced, and then taking that to a specific product is still a challenging thing. The methodologies for some of that is contested, particularly if you have a recycled input into that as well. How does pre versus post-consumer count, and so on. This process of allocating claims, whether it be performance as a whole or a specific footprint or a specific data point, is challenging because of all of those supply chain steps that there. And then, of course, flowing that information accurately through, recalculating it at a step where mixing is happening. These are challenging things. People are certainly turning their attention to them. It's a major issue of discussion in our own standards, but it's not a mature space at this point. So on that, I just wanted to kind of zoom back out and say, I think it's important to take a comprehensive approach. That's certainly our philosophy within ASI. We look to make sure that a breadth of issues are addressed, that we understand that sustainability topics are very much interrelated. If you kind of over-focus on one piece, for example, to say hydropower is the answer, that may seed impacts through large dam developments on Indigenous communities and so on, just as one small example. And within ASI, of course, we have multiple downstream use sectors, the whole value chain engaged. So, we do see the value, and this is, I think, what MECLA is looking to do as well, to kind of have those cross-industry learnings. So, perhaps the packaging sector is more mature, in some of the thinking they've been doing on recycling than in some other sectors, and so those kind of dialogues are really valuable. So on that, happy to discuss further and take any questions you've got. Our website, as I said, has a ton of information if you're interested. We have a mailing list with a public newsletter every month, so feel free to join up to that and keep in touch with what's going on in our space. Thanks.
Yeah. Fiona, thank you very much. I think that global perspective and the willingness to embrace complexity is so valuable for our discussion. And as you say, that's what MECLA is about. I was interested in your point about responsible sourcing taking on many elements, and in some, well, essentially that involves making choices, doesn't it? So I think eyes wide open is the outcome we want from this, so that those decisions aren't purely on one criteria. Yes, we are very much focused on carbon, but I think the recognizing that our own industry is an ecosystem, and that's an ecosystem within broader systems. So thank you for those insights. Please stay on the line. We are a little bit over time, but the conversation's so engaging. So hang in there and we'll come to Q&A shortly.